session at the beginning of week 4 of our course. I am thrilled to have a friend, Peter Bergen, with us today, and I have to say, you students, this is a real honor to have him because I feel as if he's just one of the top commentators we have on this topic. And I've known Peter since we invited him to come to Duke, and if you look over my shoulder, you can't really see it because of the glare. It's the poster from the event when he came a number of years ago. And I've also sent some of my very best students his way to help with research. So Peter Bergen, thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon.
Thank you, sir.
And of course, we're going to put up on our website, his most recent book is called Manhunt, The 10-Year Search for Osama bin Laden. And personally, my favorite of his book is called The Longest War, which we assign every year that all my students have to read. And we're going to put links to those up on our website, so if you're interested in finding them, you can. Peter, why don't we start kind of back in some of your early days. We're talking about the al-Qaeda ideology and Osama bin Laden, and you're one of the few people who has ever interviewed bin Laden, certainly one of the few American journalists who has. Maybe you could just tell our students who really only know him almost as an icon, what was he like? What was it like to interact with him?
Well, you know, we spent about an hour and a half with him. This was in 1997. I wasn't completely sure what he, you know, we had very little information before we went to go and meet with him. So, yeah, I wasn't sure whether he'd be a sort of table-thumping revolutionary or whether he'd be something else. He turned out to be kind of a very mild-mannered, almost like a clerical figure. He didn't raise his voice. He delivered his whole interview in a very even kind of manner. He spoke with a lot of rage about the United States and its foreign policy in the Middle East, but he didn't raise his voice. The people around him treated him with a lot of respect. They called him the Sheikh, a term of a sort of term of honorific term. They people. One thing that just struck me, Dr. Schanzer, was a lot of the people around him spoke pretty good English, which wasn't something which I'd necessarily expected. But it goes to the fact that the people in the top kind of echelon of al-Qaeda pretty well educated. You know, Osama bin Laden himself is the son of a billionaire. He went to probably the best high school in Saudi Arabia. Actually a high school, by the way, organized along British lines. He went to King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, which is a very good university for, you know, by regional standards. And so, you know, the people in his inner circle tended to be well educated. They spoke English, and he himself speaks English. He didn't speak English in the interview, but we could tell he wouldn't wait for the question to be translated. He would often just answer it immediately because he understands English.
So, looking back, you're a student of bin Laden and his life. You know, looking back on the early part of his life through university, what do you see as some of the core influences on him that moved him to this radical ideology? As you mentioned, he was the son of an incredibly wealthy businessman, and he was, you know, well integrated into society. He didn't suffer personal indignities. What were the core influences, do you think, that moved him towards this radical ideology?
You know, I mean, it's a process, as you've documented in your own work. It's a process, and it began with bin Laden. Let's start with the fact that, you know, he's the son of a billionaire, but he is, his father, you know, he probably saw on just a few occasions in his life. Bin Laden has 53 siblings, about half brothers, about half sisters. You know, his father died when he was age 10. His father married his mother, and they only had one child, which was Osama bin Laden. She was one of the around 20 wives that his father had. So this is a dad who has 53 kids. It's not like he also has a huge business he's running. He wasn't lavishing much attention. So bin Laden didn't get to spend a lot of time with his father. His father was, by most accounts, very anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist, and that might have been an influence. He certainly admired his father a lot. He himself was a very religiously devoted kid. I mean, unusually so, even by the standards of 1970s Saudi Arabia, a very conservative society. Bin Laden stood out as a teenager because he was fasting twice a week. He was praying 7 times a day, twice more than is required. And that sort of religiosity, he just had from the beginning. And then when he goes to university, he's certainly reading Sayyid Qutb, who you mentioned in the introduction. He is, in fact, going to lectures by Muhammad Qutb, who is Sayyid Qutb's brother and was sort of the keeper of the Sayyid Qutbian message after his brother was executed in 1966. And he's also growing up in what was the time called the Sawa, which is a sort of religious awakening in the 70s in not only in Saudi Arabia but around the Muslim world. And all this comes to a head really when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979. And bin Laden immediately volunteers to go and get involved in that effort to basically get the Russians out of Afghanistan. It's the first time that a non-Muslim nation had invaded a Muslim nation for decades, and it was a transformational moment for bin Laden. And so he went there as a very religiously observant Saudi, and he emerged 10 years later as a very committed radical because basically he started fighting the Soviets himself. He set up Al-Qaeda towards the end of the war. And the mission of Al-Qaeda, which didn't even mention the United States in its founding minutes, was essentially to take the group of people who had fought against the Soviets and have them fight in other jihads elsewhere. And for bin Laden, the first jihad that he thought of that he was going to participate in was back in Yemen, where his family originated from, where there was a socialist government in the south, and bin Laden wanted to volunteer to get his men to fight against the socialist government of southern Yemen.
What is it about him that you think maybe suited him to actually lead this movement?
That's a very good question, which the people who really know him well are sort of surprised by, who I've interviewed after my '97 interview with bin Laden. I interviewed a lot of his friends and families, members and associates, and people and a lot of them were surprised about the route he took. They didn't think of him as being a natural leader. In fact, the picture of bin Laden, many of the people listening to this Google Hangout are in your early 20s. Bin Laden in his early 20s was very shy. If he was in a room, he could come into a room, sit there for hours, and he wouldn't he'd have no conversation at all. He didn't seem like somebody who would go on to be a leader of men. And I think what really transformed him is in 1985, he actually went into Afghanistan and started leading his own very small unit of mostly Saudi university students who were fighting the Russians. And that event, I think, transformed him, and some of his friends from his university days began noticing he changed. He was much less willing to take criticism. He sort of began to get a lot of press back in Saudi Arabia. People started writing articles about him, and I think, by the time he was 30, he was pretty confident of his own leadership abilities. And then more broadly, why did people look to him as a leader? In Hollywood terms, he had a great backstory. Son of a billionaire, gives up everything, goes to Afghanistan, fights heroically against the Soviets. That was appealing. And I think the other thing, Dr. Schanzer, is that he became a leader who was able to explain in a very simple way his message. I mean, history's greatest leaders are able to communicate messages in a simple fashion. They can be false. For instance, the idea that Hitler propagated, that essentially the Jews were responsible for the problems of Germany. And of course, in bin Laden's case, they were also false, but it was a very simple message, which was the West is at war with Islam, and that war is led by the United States, and you need to take revenge. And that message, unfortunately, has had a number of takers.
Yes. Well, let's turn to the message now. In our lectures for this week, we're going to be talking about the various sources of grievance that fuel Al-Qaeda, and also, as you just outlined, some of its core ideas. But let me ask you this: what is it that, and maybe you partially answered this already, but what is it that people you think find attractive about this ideology? I mean, after all, it involves incredibly strict practices that are, very joyless. No music, no entertainment of many sorts. Of course, it's violent. There's a tremendous amount of risk. You have to travel, leave your family and other pursuits to find the conflict where it is. It calls on, and of course, the core element of martyrdom. You put all that together, and it's a pretty harsh, and when you look at it, an ideology that's not very attractive. Yet you say that it's found many takers. What is its resonance? What is it? Why is it that people want to follow this Al-Qaeda ideology?
Well, again, it's a complicated question, but I think it begins with the fact that bin Laden's political message has, I travel a lot in the Muslim world, and some parts of bin Laden's message are widely shared. So, for instance, the United States supports Israel too much, or the United States supports authoritarian regimes in the Middle East too much, like the Saudis, and until recently the Mubarak regime, and now we're back again with the military regime in Egypt, which the United States continues basically to support. So there's that element, but those views are shared by a lot of Muslims around the Muslim world. The question is that what's the appeal to the other things you've talked about, which is the more sort of Taliban-like ideology, the desire for martyrdom, and of course that is a much, much smaller group of people who are influenced by those ideas. And I think part of let's just look at something that's in the news right now, which is what happened in Kenya with the attack on the mall. Now, there have been reports, so far unsubstantiated, that there were 3 American citizens involved. Whether or not they were involved, the fact is that this group, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, which is behind the attack, has recruited American citizens, many of them from Minneapolis. What was the recruitment pitch that worked with these guys? And they were all guys. And I think it was something along the following. Your country's under attack by Ethiopia, which invaded in 2006. It's a Christian country. This is a war against the Crusaders and their allies. It's a religious war. You need to be part of it. And by the way, it's going to be, if you come over to Somalia and fight, it's going to be fun. You're going to be able to shoot guns. You're going to be part of a holy war. And they post a sort of rather romantic view of the whole thing. In fact, in one YouTube video, one of the Americans, he's trying to recruit other Americans to come. He says it's going to be like Disneyland. Now, of course, that's not true at all. But the fact is that there is a kind of romantic, kind of cool part of this that is appealing to young men in search of meaning. And if you're based in Minneapolis and you're living in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the United States, which is where a lot of these Somali Americans who went to fight for Shabab live, that going to Somalia might seem like a better deal than working in some dead-end job at Minneapolis airport and with very little future ahead of you.
I think these are great points, and I think there's a misunderstanding amongst many that, well, every person that believes part of this ideology must endorse all of it. I mean, my impression of the Tsarnaev brothers, for example, is that they didn't really know squat about Sharia law and really couldn't care less whether it was implemented in Boston or anywhere in the former caliphate. I don't really think that was core on their minds. But
that's a good. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I was just Jahar, who's the younger brother. I was just reading through his Twitter account last night, and his preoccupations, age 19, were the typical preoccupations of a lot of people his age. It was mostly he probably tweeted a couple of thousand times. Almost none of it was about Islam. A lot of it was just about hanging out and smoking weed and cute chicks. And now the older brother, Tamerlane, I think was really a different matter. Tamerlane began to take Islam very seriously, began to become more and more devout, traveled to Dagestan, it looks like in 2012, to hook up with some militants fighting the Russian state, That didn't work out, but he was already pretty militant by the time he arrived. So yes, I think in some cases, certainly the people who recruited these groups often are not Islamic scholars by any stretch of the imagination, and some are more observant than others, and there's no hard and fast generality.
Well, I think this was a good start. I want to give some of our students an opportunity to jump in and ask Peter Bergen a question. Justin, who do we have with us?
Dylan is here from Australia. Dylan, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yeah. Hi. How are you? I was wondering. You were interviewed by Fareed Zakaria a few weeks ago, and you're talking about the. You or somebody else on the panel was talking about how there's a potential that now that the Muslim Brotherhood's been banned in Egypt, that there's going to be people who are looking for a more Islamist state with Sharia law, this kind of thing. That now the only options are going to be for that to be achieved through violent means. Do you think that kind of what do you think over the next decade? Like, I mean, with what's happened last week with the Free Syrian Army being kind of turned against by the al-Nusra Front in Syria, do you think that that's kind of the first step in a collection of those?
Well, let's try to keep to one topic at a time. So we talk first about the Muslim Brotherhood. Why don't we let Peter respond to that, and I'm sure we can get to the al-Nusra Front as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a very good question, and in the United States right now, Syria kind of took over as a news story from Egypt, but really what happened in Egypt is arguably more important because, of course, it's the largest Arab country, and we talked about Saeed Qutb earlier, who was, of course, Egyptian, and many of the ideas that have informed al-Qaeda come out of Egypt, as indeed many ideas that, positive things come out of Egypt that affect the Arab world. So what happens in Egypt is incredibly important, and the fact that a democratically elected Islamist government has been nullified by a military coup, essentially. It is obviously a coup, is a problem because it confirms Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda. It confirms his narrative that elections are against Islam and they'll never allow a real Islamic government to be elected. And the only way to get change in the Middle East is through violence, and I think that's a big problem. And the fact that obviously in Syria, that the al-Qaeda-allied groups are crowding out the more quote-unquote moderate groups, I think is also a problem. So the early promise of the Arab Spring is really sort of not really coming. I was one of the optimists about the Arab Spring. I thought it would undercut al-Qaeda and its message. And initially, I think it did, but unfortunately, the chaotic conditions in many countries are proving to be a fruitful ground for al-Qaeda. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to, come to power or anything like that, but it does provide more breathing space for them.
Yeah, I was struck. For my class here at Duke this morning, we were reading first the 2003 counterterrorism strategy, and then the 2011. And I noted that they were both written at a kind of giddy moment of our counterterrorism efforts. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq had gone exceptionally well, and America was feeling its oats about assertions of its power. And then in 2011, it was the Arab Spring, and it looked like the whole tide was turning against bin Laden and al-Qaeda, of course, and then he was killed in that year as well. But 2 years later, it's the idea that the Arab Spring could be the Arab disappointment could be yet another fuel of grievance that we could add, that the al-Qaeda propagandists will then add to the very long list that it already has.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay, Justin. Let's bring another student in.
We have Shujaudeen. Yes. Can you
please introduce yourself and tell us where you're from?
Okay, right now we don't hear you. So what I'd like to do, if you can examine your icon in the upper right, your gear with settings, try that out. Zubair also posted a question here, so I'll go ahead and read that.
Okay.
He
Where's
asks,
Zubair from?
I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
He asks, he says he's from Washington, D.C. What value do fatwas from mainstream Sunni scholars have to counterterrorism, extremism, when the scholars who give the fatwas are usually considered infidels? What role does mainstream Sunni Islam have in countering terrorism and extremism?
I think the role of mainstream Sunni Islamic scholars who are issuing these fatwas is incredibly important, because what you're trying to do, you're never going to persuade the truly committed that these ideas are wrong, or it's going to be difficult. But you want to persuade people who are flirting with these ideas that they aren't sanctioned by mainstream Sunni Islam. And I'll give you a very and it's particularly powerful, by the way, if these fatwas are coming from people who themselves were hardline clerics in the past. A very concrete example of this is Salman al-Auda, who is a Saudi cleric who basically was quite spiritually influential on bin Laden. They only met, I think, once, but this guy is a very, very well-known cleric with impeccable sort of Salafi credentials, and basically in 2006 he issued a fatwa condemning not just Al-Qaeda or terrorism or some kind of vague, he actually condemned Osama bin Laden by name, and I think that was very helpful. So these fatwas certainly, at a minimum are in neutral in their effect, and I think sometimes are actually quite positive.
Okay, he can ask a follow-up if he wants on the chat. Do we have our other student? Has he gotten his volume working?
Shujadin?
Apparently not.
We can see you, we can't hear you. I do have one other question by another student from our forums.
Okay.
He asks, what's your assessment, Peter, of cooperation among governments on counterterrorism efforts? What would positive, productive cooperation involve? And can you imagine cooperative efforts that would be counterproductive?
I mean, I think almost every government in the world, you can't name a government that isn't opposed for one reason or another to Al-Qaeda and groups like it. Because Al-Qaeda said it's at war with every Western government, every Middle Eastern government, every South Asian government, every Russia, China, India. So all governments essentially have an interest in combating this, and I think the cooperation has been very good. I mean, you can point to any number of Al-Qaeda plots that were broken up because of cooperation between governments, and you can also point to a number of plots, unfortunately, by Al-Qaeda and associated groups where there was information passed to certain governments who didn't react. I mean, go back to this Shabab attack on the Kenya Mall, Westgate. It seems the U.S. government was warning about the possibility of an attack on this mall for some period of time. Similarly with Mumbai in 2008, the U.S. government warned the Indian government about an attack basically from the sea directed at hotels in Mumbai, which is exactly what happened when the Lashkar-e-Taiba did the attack in November of 2008. So, but also the British government has been very helpful to the U.S. government, vice versa. The Pakistani government has been very helpful to the British government and the U.S. government, and vice versa, in helping eliminate plots. So, plenty of governments. There's no lack of cooperation.
Peter, let me ask you a question that brings us to modern times. I was reading this 2003 strategy, and it actually talked about how our goal was to suppress the scope and capabilities of Al-Qaeda. So it was first transformed or squished into a regional movement, and then a local movement, and then it could be snuffed out. And reading your recent paper, which we'll also post for the students that you did with Bruce Hoffman, talking about the modern trend of thinking that the core Al-Qaeda's capabilities, the organization that attacked us on September 11th, had been greatly diminished and injured, and these are becoming more regional movements. How do you assess things as we stand now? Are these attacks that are taking place, are they symptomatic of these regional, more local efforts that aren't really global and is threatening to the U.S., or is there kind of a model maybe for Al-Qaeda, global Al-Qaeda resurgence based on recent circumstances? What's your read on that?
Well, you know, Bruce Hoffman and I were the lead authors on the report, and we kind of, you know, we had our disagreements and we worked them out. I mean, and I think it produced a better paper as a result. I mean, so it's incontrovertible that Al-Qaeda Central is, you know, in bad shape. Bin Laden himself was writing memos to his own people, which were recovered at the compound in which he was killed, in which he made those points. Drone attacks had really damaged him, his people. The Al-Qaeda brand was in really bad shape. And yet, you know, we have the al-Nusra Front in Syria, and, you know, being the most effective force fighting against the Assad regime, which kind of speaks for itself. Now, you know, we're sitting here in the United States conducting this, and people are listening around the world. As a matter of United States national security, a Nusra front that controls big chunks of North Syria is certainly not at all desirable, but does it mean that from there you can launch an attack on the United States? You know, maybe not. You know, and if you did or tried to, you know, right now the authorization for the use of military force that governs U.S. military activity in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Yemen could be applied to Syria. Forget about the whole issue of the chemical weapons, but if you felt that there was a real threat from an Al-Qaeda affiliate, the president has legal authorization under the authorization for the use of military force to go over Al-Qaeda-allied groups, wherever they are. So, you know, we're in a different situation than we were 2 years ago, but the actual threat to the homeland United States may just be, you know, basically still homegrown people without much capacity, as we saw in the Boston Marathon, who can certainly inflict a tragedy but cannot inflict something that is catastrophic in nature like Al-Qaeda did on 9/11. So that's where we are, and, you know, it's hard to predict how this will play out. But Al-Qaeda, you know, has been handed a bit of a lifeline in Syria and in other places where the Arab Spring is not playing out in the more hopeful way that I and many others hoped would happen.
Okay, we still have this gentleman who's trying to get in. Is his video working yet? Hello?
That's Zubair, whose video is not showing right now.
Zubair,
So
I mean, not his video, is his audio working?
his audio is still not working for Shujuddin.
Okay, well, I think we have time then for one more question. Yeah,
I've got
from Australia.
Yeah, sure.
I was just going to ask, just in terms of the, the current strategy, just in terms of dealing with insurgents, seems to be. Jeremy Scahill was in front of Congress and he said quite about the killing fields and just growing in number because you're trying to kill your way to peace. Do you think that, I mean, there was an attempt a couple of months ago in Afghanistan to try and kind of open talks with the Taliban. Do you think that there's a diplomatic solution with parts of those kind of, you were speaking about how the Al-Qaeda groups have started kind of splintering around. Do you think that there are parts of those that could be that are more liable to become more moderate and maybe?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the Al-Qaeda groups becoming more moderate. That's, you know, highly unlikely. Once you've become sort of an Al-Qaeda affiliate or allied with Al-Qaeda, there's only one example of an Al-Qaeda affiliated group basically doing a peace deal, which is the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was loosely affiliated, not a formal part of Al-Qaeda, actually did a peace deal with the Gaddafi government before the fall of the Gaddafi regime. But that's quite exceptional. Now, separately, can you do a peace deal with the Taliban? You know, this has been discussed for years. Really nothing has come of it so far. You know, these kinds of deals take a long time to do. It took 30 years for the British to come to peace with the IRA, and there's a lot of suspicion on both sides, usually for good reason. And we've seen the Taliban peace talks, which are they're not even peace talks, they're initial discussions about negotiations, have fallen apart for one reason or another. Now, the Pakistanis have released the number 2 leader of the Taliban just within the last few days, and he could be a good person for a real discussion to begin with. But I'm not holding my breath. I've always been very skeptical about peace talks with the Taliban. There have been peace negotiations between the Taliban and the Pakistani government on several occasions. The Taliban's always reneged on those peace deals. So, and since the Taliban doesn't really recognize the Afghan-Pakistan border, I think we've already seen what peace deals with the Taliban look like. They don't succeed even if you have one.
Well, Justin, do we have in writing Shu Jahin's question?
Yes, I was just going to ask.
Can you just read it, and I think that we'll have to wrap it up then.
Okay. He would like to know if there was a primary reason why Al-Qaeda chose America as a target as opposed to another nation.
I think bin Laden, I base this response on somebody called Abu Musab al-Suri, who is one of Al-Qaeda's sort of leading ideologues, and he was one of the people who I met when I went to see bin Laden. He was one of the people who facilitated that, and I spent a fair amount of time with. I didn't understand what role he played in the group until much later, but he said that he wrote a 1,600-page kind of history of the jihadi movement in 2005, 2004. He posted it to the internet, and in that he said, look, the reason bin Laden had a sort of strategic analysis, which was twofold. First of all, that the United States was weak, just like the former Soviet Union, and when the former Soviet Union collapsed, all its client regimes in Eastern Europe also collapsed. And so bin Laden thought that if you attack the United States, it would pull out of the Middle East, and all its client regimes in the Middle East, such as the Saudis and others, would collapse. That turned out to be an incredibly naive belief. The United States wasn't as weak as its former Soviet Union. An attack on the United States quite didn't get us to pull out of the Middle East. We're more involved in the Middle East than we've ever been in our history, with presence in Afghanistan, 8-year occupation in Iraq, huge military bases in Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. So, but that's the reason bin Laden attacked. It was a flawed strategic analysis of how the world worked.
Well, Peter Bergen, you're one of the world's authorities on this topic, and I think our students are so grateful. Many, many more will be watching later this week as we go forward with our lectures. And I know your time is in great demand, so especially given the events of this week in Nigeria and Kenya. So many thanks for joining us, and thank you for your wise comments.
Thank you, Dr. Schanzer.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.